Cyber espionage and hacking campaigns have become a key component of the hidden world of international statecraft. But while we often hear about threats originating from Russia, China, and North Korea, there's another country with a growing reputation for conducting hacking campaigns. I'm Danny Palmer, this is ZDNet Security Update, and with me to discuss cyber threats emanating from Iran is Rafe Pilling, Senior Security Researcher at Secureworks. Thanks for joining me. First of all, how did Iran first emerge as a cyber threat over the last decade or so?
Good question, and thanks for having me on today, Danny. It's great to be here. So, the Iranian cyber capability evolved out of their sort of patriotic hacker community, if you could call it that. So we have a group of probably relatively young people conducting sort of defacement activity just off their own sort of motivation. There are disputes within the Middle East, and they're sort of conducting defacement campaigns to support that kind of to further their cause in that sense, and also for personal kudos. They had a fairly active security community based around forums. There was a lot of tool development going on. And around the sort of 2009, 2010 period, there were some events occurring in Iran involving cyber capabilities deployed against them, which might have acted as a sort of an impetus for them to sort of up their game. And since that time, they have been sort of evolving that capability, coming on in leaps and bounds, really. And certainly one of the sort of top four users of offensive cyber activity these days, as part of their, I guess their sort of arsenal of capabilities to make their presence felt, to sort of further foreign policy, that kind of thing.
In terms of the motivations behind these attacks, you mentioned foreign policy there. I mean, is that just the motivation behind this, or are there other things driving the state-backed or arm's-length state-backed hacking scene in Iran?
So it's interesting you say arm's length as well. Historically, Iran has always conducted, or historically, in the last sort of 20 or so years perhaps, conducted warfare through proxies, whether that's sort of proxy/terrorist organizations or made up sort of online personas that seem to emerge in the wake of a particular attack and then sort of disappear as quickly as they appeared. So they often act through these proxy forces. You have a similar sort of model there. It's hard to know exactly how things work over there, but we certainly suspect that there was an evolution of these patriotic hackers moving into more sort of legitimate security companies, and then taking perhaps contracts, perhaps less formal than that, work opportunities on behalf of the government, and then their capabilities are directed in that sense. So they provide a variety of functions. There is definitely a domestic monitoring capability, so sort of politically driven monitoring of political views that they find contrary to their own, and that there is a sort of definitely some internal schisms. So you may find that those parties, those capabilities are even being deployed by different arms of government against other arms of government, as well as the population. Then you have the sort of monitoring and surveillance of the Iranian diaspora, so people around the world that are, maybe have drawn the interest of Iran for one reason or another. And then obviously you have sort of responses to attacks in the Middle East, or not responses to attacks, sorry, but responses to sort of things that they find as incitements of some kind. So we have some of the wiper attacks, for example, that we've seen, generally speaking, after events that Iran finds objectionable, and they're using that to sort of, again, via some sort of proxy, semi-deniable persona, but it becomes quite clear where that sort of traces back to.
So what are some of the main techniques and tactics that these campaigns use? I mean, you've touched on wiper campaigns, but there's also various phishing campaigns that have been linked to Iran over the years, be they targeting individuals or whole organizations. Yeah,
that's correct. So Iranian groups, of which we track sort of in excess of 21 clusters of different Iranian threat group activity, runs the full gamut of techniques. So phishing is heavily used. There are groups that seem to sort of predominantly rely on phishing in order to get credentials, to gain access to networks or email accounts. So that's a big one, gaining access to Gmail, Yahoo, that kind of thing, accounts of targets of interest. Then there is, I mean, everything really. Scan and exploit activity. We sort of see a lot of password spraying activity where this is, they're trying to use a small list of passwords against a large volume of accounts at a particular target and just run through that until they get in, and that has a degree of success. We've seen DNS hijacking. There's a lot of custom malware development comes out of Iran. I mean, anything really, and they seem to take a lot of inspiration from open source sort of offensive security tools, frameworks that are put out for red teams to use. They will sort of pick those up and use them. They will take any other tools. So we had the sort of Shadow Broker suite of tools that was released. That was then picked up by several Iranian groups and used. Some of the sort of Eternal Blue exploits and others from that suite of exploits. So yeah, they'll really try anything, which is why they're an interesting sort of set of groups to watch. Even if you don't think you're going to be directly a target, if you can defend against the sort of tradecraft that they use, you're probably in a good stead to deal with most cyber threats.
And we saw last year Iranian hacking groups hit the headlines because they were called out essentially for targeting academic institutions here in the UK with phishing attacks. And it just goes to show that their campaigns are getting more ambitious, but as they're getting more ambitious, they're perhaps not hiding their tracks as well as they might like.
Yeah. So this was a series of campaigns been going for quite a long time. So Cobalt Dickens, we call this group, this cluster. There was indictments related to a particular set of individuals and activities associated with the Mabna Institute, and we believe this is the same continuation of that same activity that was called out. And yeah, so that's an interesting one. It looks like the intent there is to gain access to academic resources in order to sort of circumvent some of the sanctions that have been placed on them that prevent them accessing those resources legitimately, perhaps. And certainly there'll be, that will be linked to both sort of universities there as well as potential sort of links to the military and government that were called out in the FBI indictments. But yeah, exactly. So we have academic targeting as well as all the sort of targeting of diplomatic, military type entities, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Then we see sort of tech companies getting targeted. There are very few sectors that really aren't untouched in one way or another. They won't all be sort of followed up on to the same degree, and as they won't all be as important to the Iranian regime, but it's quite difficult to sort of assess who will be a target of these campaigns.
And how has Iranian activity developed during 2020? Obviously, there's been some major events throughout this year, but thinking back to January, there was a high-profile assassination of an Iranian general. Did that have any impact on how Iran started conducting itself in the cyber world at the start of this year? And how has Iranian activity altered as the years moved on and the world faced things like coronavirus and other threats?
So that was definitely a concern at the time it happened. There was an expectation from, well, there was a lot of concern, let's say, from customers that this would kick off sort of a round of destructive attacks, perhaps focused on the US. In sort of 2013, 2014, we saw the DDoS capabilities being deployed against US financial institutions. There was some expectation that might be resurrected. On the other hand, we counseled that we didn't think that was going to happen, not least because the action itself was a sort of a military strike. It's the sort of thing that would call for a military response, and in fact, we did see one a period of time later with these sort of missile bombardments of US bases in Iraq. I think the response may have been slightly tempered around sort of Because of the downing of the Iranian jetliner during the sort of immediate aftermath of that strike, and I think that very quickly sort of changed the tide of both international opinion, but also sort of domestic opinion within Iran, and they had to sort of change tack quite quickly there. So there was a response in a military sense. We didn't see a spike in cyber activity. We saw continuation of existing campaigns from established groups, activity that we'd seen starting before the strike occurred, and then continued after the fact. During 2020, we it is always hard to say. Anecdotally, it seems like there was a dip, certainly in some months of activity. We have certainly seen activity throughout sort of 2019. There were some campaigns from a group we call Cobalt Foxglove in January. So this is also known as sort of Fox Kitten or Pioneer Kitten, I believe. They like to use VPN vulnerabilities quite quickly after they're released. So back then it was the CB 2019 19781 vulnerability that they were exploiting, Citrix NetScaler vulnerability, getting into, exploiting that, dropping a web shell, and then using that to sort of come back and access the network later. We then recently saw very much the same sort of pattern, but using the F5 big IP vulnerability, CB 2020-5902, but with the same sort of pattern of activity. And it's almost potentially the case that they are using these vulnerabilities in a sort of a spray and pray fashion, just hitting as many vulnerable entities as they can find, deploying these web shells, and then coming back afterwards to triage what access they've gained through that sort of campaign. So it highlights two things. First of all, there are threat groups out there that will very quickly pick up on proof of concept exploits and put those into their campaign, add them to their sort of campaigns. There's also this kind of opportunistic element of it. So if you happen to be vulnerable to that exploit, you may end up with an Iranian actor on your network for no other reason than you were vulnerable. And then later on, they'll decide what they're going to do with you. Are they going to use you for infrastructure? Is there a potential monetization opportunity? And that's something else we see, is that certainly groups that look like they are sort of maybe commercial entities or private sector entities working on behalf of the government, you may find people conducting sort of side jobs for their own personal gain, as well as whatever the kind of contractual task was.
So how does Iranian activity compare to other nations that we often hear about as cyber threat actors?
They definitely have their own sort of style. We don't see the same level of sophistication with Iran as we might with some of the high-end capabilities from Russia or China. That said, we did have a case where it appears that two tools, Neuron and Nautilus, were taken by Russian hackers, state-affiliated hackers, and used for an extended period of time to the extent that it was believed that those tools were Russian tools, and it was later disclosed by the UK's NCSC that in fact they believe those tools came from Iran originally and were sort of taken and used by Russian groups. And at the time, everyone thought those tools were sort of plausibly Russian, so demonstrated sort of some of the better end of the sort of tool spectrum of that Iran can put out. And then obviously they're probably in I guess a middle ground position between sort of Russia and China, which do use their capabilities for sort of espionage, to some extent to vent frustration. So we've seen some wiper attacks that have been attributed to Russian groups, things like Olympic Destroyer, likely linked to displeasure of being excluded from the Olympics in South Korea. But generally speaking, Russia and China have sort of diplomatic, economic ties with the rest of the world, and so the use of cyber capabilities is calibrated against some of the other sort of capabilities they have, and also sort of potential weak points that they have. North Korea is at the other end of the spectrum, so it doesn't have good diplomatic relations with anyone really. Doesn't have economic relations. It doesn't have a good sort of economy. Doesn't really have a lot to lose, and so they lean heavily on their cyber program and their nuclear program in order to keep themselves relevant, keep the sort of focus and attention on them, and try and sort of use that as a bargaining chip on the international stage. Obviously, they heavily use espionage for sort of science and technology, information theft, monitoring of sort of North Korean defectors and other people of interest, but also as a revenue stream. And they have also demonstrated they're more than willing to sort of launch destructive attacks. And Iran is probably somewhere in the middle. You know, they definitely have a lot of sort of domestic concerns. They do want to be considered sort of a sort of a relevant country on the international stage, particularly sort of in the Middle East. And so they do use cyber capabilities heavily, but again, they're calibrated to a certain degree. So most of the wiper attacks we've seen, for example, have been against their sort of near neighbors in the Middle East, particularly against sort of Saudi Arabia. If they were to do that elsewhere, there might be a sort of a different response, and they kind of recognize that, I think, and walk the line carefully. Obviously, there have been some outliers to that where wiping incidents have been conducted against sort of in the US and things like that, but it's a rare occasion versus seeing those capabilities deployed in the Middle East.
You mentioned how many of these Iranian campaigns are somewhat opportunistic. So what should organizations be doing to ensure their network is secure so they don't fall victim to one of these attacks just because they're potentially open to one?
Great question. And that's, again, where the sort of gamut of tradecraft comes in. So from a phishing perspective, it's your normal sort of email filtering. It's running phishing awareness campaigns within the organization, make sure that employees are regularly sort of reminded of the threat of phishing activity. And that covers a whole range of cyber threats as well. It's not just Iranian groups. It's potentially the number one means of gaining access to an organization these days. Although there are some things that are helping sort of fuel a drop-off in that. So multi-factor authentication is a big one. Even if your employees do have their credentials phished, having multi-factor authentication, requiring that sort of second or more factor can render those credentials useless, even if they are taken, and certainly make it more difficult for a threat actor to gain access to an account, particularly if it's sort of from a cloud service provider. Increasingly, we see organizations using cloud services, and you become sort of one password away from compromise of not just email, but potentially significant amount of corporate data. So in those sort of environments, multi-factor authentication is an absolute must. I think Microsoft released a report saying something like your 99.9% of the cases of phishing that they observed were against accounts that didn't have multi-factor authentication enabled. It's a huge win. Then we have approaches via social media. So perhaps more than any other nation, Iran likes to use social media to approach targets, whether that be LinkedIn, Facebook, engaging in conversations via WhatsApp. We had a very interesting case study a few years back relating to a persona called Mia Ash that was contacting a target, gaining a relationship with an employee at that company, and then use that to try and get malware into the organization by a pretense they had to answer this survey, and they should do it at their office because it will run better on the corporate systems. So they will use the sort of full gamut of social media to try and deliver malware into their targets. Then we've seen some of the more interesting capabilities around sort of DNS hijacking, and some of that can be more difficult to defend against. But certainly phishing, social media, patching your perimeter, the scan and exploit activity we talked about, it's also very common. Password spraying, common, and that helps get mitigated by multi-factor authentication. Those are some of the big ways that Iranian actors and plenty of other groups will attempt to get into networks.
That's some really great advice, Ray. Thanks for joining me. It's certainly a very interesting subject area, and there's more to, if you want to find out more about this sort of thing, be sure to check out ZDNet, where there is a case study which I wrote on the Mia Ash campaign from 3 years ago. So that's there if you want to check it out. Thanks for watching ZDNet Security Update. We'll be back next week. Thank you.